In almost every bear attack on record, there is a single measurable distance, feet, sometimes inches, that separates the version of the story where someone walks out and the version where they don't. Tonight, we're breaking down 6 encounters across 3 countries and 2 decades, from a Montana elk drainage to a fog-bound stand of oak on the Russian Pacific coast. We'll look at what the terrain did to close that distance without warning, what each person did once it was already gone, and what wildlife investigators on 3 continents concluded once the ground was measured and the animals were identified. This isn't about who panicked. It's about how little room these encounters actually leave, and how differently that room gets used. The pattern holds no matter the species or the decade. The moment always arrives faster than anyone is ready for. Here's where it started. Grant Ashworth decided to follow the blood trail alone instead of waiting for his brother-in-law to catch up. That decision cost him his life 11 minutes later, 40 yards into a stand of subalpine fir, next to the bull elk he'd shot and the grizzly that had already claimed it. It was the second week of September 2004 in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, Montana. Country locals just call the Bob, 90 miles of roadless timber and river drainage west of the Continental Divide. Ashworth was 41, from Kalispell, on his 6th elk hunt in this drainage, and good enough at it that his partner, Dale Kinnick, trusted him to track a marginal shot without an argument. The bull had taken a quartering-away hit from Ashworth's Winchester Model 70, chambered in .300 Win Mag, loaded with 180-grain Nosler partitions, a rifle and round entirely capable of anchoring an elk at 200 yards. But the shot had been low, catching liver instead of both lungs, and the animal had run. The 2 men had left their spike camp at 5:40 that morning in a hard frost, glassing a burn slope until the bull stepped out at 240 yards with a cow trailing behind him. This time, the bull had quartered away at the shot, dropping his front end and bolting into standing timber instead of piling up in the open. Ashworth reloaded, watched the impact, and told Kinnick it was a good hit, even as some part of him registered the angle had been worse than he wanted to admit. A small, private disagreement with himself that neither man raised out loud. Kinnick wanted to back out and let the wound stiffen the elk overnight. Ashworth didn't. Light was going, rain was coming, and he'd lost a wounded animal to a stiffened trail once before and never forgiven himself for it. He told Kinnick to mark the last blood and hold there. He went in alone, rifle up, moving slower than his instincts wanted, reading spatter on salal leaves. What Ashworth didn't know was that the elk had already died 90 seconds after it stopped being visible, and that a boar grizzly working the same drainage for a fall salmon run had found it first. The drainage narrowed as he went, subalpine fir crowding in until the blood trail was the only clear line through the understory. Twice he stopped to listen, hearing nothing but the creek 40 feet below and his own breathing. And twice he told himself the silence meant the elk had bedded down somewhere close, weakening, waiting to be finished. That red was correct about the weakening. It was wrong about who was waiting. The bear was mature, roughly 620 pounds, in the fat-building weeks before den season, when a grizzly's caloric drive overrides almost everything else. A fresh elk carcass in September is worth defending against anything, and this one had barely started feeding. The carcass was intact enough that investigators later estimated the bear had claimed it less than 10 minutes before Ashworth arrived. Ashworth came through a wall of fir at 11 yards, and the bear was already up, already committed, ears back, weight forward, front paws planted wide over the carcass in a stance biologists call full possession posture. There was no bluff charge, no huffing or jaw-popping to signal a warning first. Bears defending a carcass they've just claimed skip that phase far more often than bears surprised in open country. The investment is already made, and the calculation shifts from avoidance to defense in less time than a person can process the shift happening. For a fraction of a second, the 2 of them simply looked at each other across 11 yards of broken timber, both concluding correctly there was no room left to back away from this. Ashworth got 1 round off, the only shot the distance and timing allowed. It caught the bear high in the chest, a survivable hit at that range against that much muscle and bone, and it did nothing to stop the closing distance. A .300 Win Mag through the chest doesn't turn off a central nervous system already flooded with adrenaline and 11 yards of momentum. Cardiac and lung damage takes seconds to matter, and 11 yards at full charge, speed takes under 2. The bear closed the gap low and fast, weight forward through the front shoulders, and Ashworth had no time to work the bolt for a second round before the collision. Kinnick, 60 yards back at the last blood marker, heard the shot, then the sound he would describe to investigators only once and never in detail again. By the time Kinnick reached the site, the bear had withdrawn to the tree line, wounded and unwilling to re-engage with a second armed man over the carcass. Ashworth was found 8 feet from his rifle. He had lived through the initial mauling. The bear moved off after the first minute, likely from the chest wound. But the injuries to his neck and upper torso were not survivable without surgery that was 4 hours of foot and helicopter travel away. Kinnick did not go into the first stand himself. He backed up 30. Medical findings and aftermath. The Flathead County Medical Examiner's reconstructed cause of death was catastrophic blood loss from bite trauma to the carotid region, consistent with a single sustained bite rather than a prolonged mauling. The pattern investigators associate with a bear that disengages once it perceives the threat neutralized, rather than one still in a defensive aggression state. Ashworth's own rifle round was recovered from the bear's carcass 11 days later, when Montana FWP tracked and euthanized the animal after it was confirmed as food conditioned to carcass sites and a repeat threat. At 41, in good physical condition, Ashworth would likely have survived a wound to almost any other part of his body long enough for extraction. He did not survive this one. No version of backcountry trauma care beats a carotid bite by more than a few minutes, and the nearest help was hours out. Incident analysis. What led to this outcome was not a single mistake, but 2 reasonable ones stacked together. Tracking a wounded elk into thick timber at last light is standard practice. Hunters do it every season without incident. The error was doing it alone, against the advice of a partner who wanted to wait, in a drainage already carrying a Grizzly sign that neither man had stopped to read carefully. Investigators noted old bear digs and a game trail heavy with scat within a quarter-mile of the recovery site, signs that, in isolation, most hunters walk past. Kinnick's decision to hold at the last blood marker, per Ashworth's own instruction, is very likely the reason there were not 2 deaths that day instead of 1. He did not follow his partner blindly. He waited, listened, and approached with his own rifle ready, which gave the bear a reason to leave rather than stay. Practical takeaway. A wounded animal and thick timber at last light is exactly when to bring a partner, not go alone. The 10 minutes you save tracking solo are not worth what you lose if something is already standing over that carcass. In the hardwood ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a woman zipped into a one-man tent would learn just how little nylon actually separates a camper from a hungry animal. The ridge above Big Run went quiet a little after 10. The kind of quiet where you can hear a single hickory nut drop 200 feet away and roll to a stop. The air had cooled fast after sunset, down into the low 50s, and somewhere below the campsite a barred owl asked its question twice and got no answer. Wood smoke from a dying fire 2 sites over drifted through camp for a while, and then thinned out, and under it, so faint that no one would have named it as a separate smell in the moment. Something greasy and animal sweet hung low in the cooling air. Nothing about the night felt wrong. That was the detail that would matter later. Nothing about it should have. Aaron Castellano, 34, had hiked into this stretch of Shenandoah National Park, Virginia, in October of 2011 for a solo weekend she did most falls, and she'd done everything the trailhead signage told her to. Food bag hung 10 feet up, 4 feet out from the trunk. Cook site 50 yards from the tent. She'd checked both distances twice before dark, the way she always did, and gone to sleep. Confident she'd covered every variable inside her own control. What she couldn't control was the camper 2 sites over who'd cooked bacon that morning and left the pan to air out instead of scrubbing it. And what neither of them could control was a 210-pound sow who had spent the last 6 weeks working the campsites along this ridge for whatever calories she could find before winter. The sow had already worked 3 other sites along the same ridge that week without incident, mostly finding nothing and moving on, which is its own kind of danger. A pattern of low-risk, low-reward visits that eventually produces one visit where the reward is real and the animal is already relaxed enough around tents to push harder than it did the first time. Castellano's site was the 4th stop that circuit, and the bacon grease residue on a pan 50 yards downwind was, to a nose that can detect food from over a mile out, no different from an open dinner bell. Castellano had picked this site for the view down the valley, close enough to 2 other tents that voices carried easily between them after dark, but far enough apart that each site felt private. The same layout that would let her shout loud enough for help to arrive in seconds once it mattered. Castellano woke to a weight against the tent wall, not a sound first. The pressure came before the noise did. She had a half-second to register the shape pressing the nylon into her shoulder before the bear's claws opened the tent fabric like it wasn't there, and a paw came through reaching for the smell of the granola bar she'd forgotten in her jacket pocket. Not for her. That distinction is the entire story of what happened next. For that first half-second, she did the thing every sleep-deprived brain does, which is try to make the shape fit something ordinary. A raccoon, a loose bungee cord, a branch dropping. The size of the paw and the sound the claws made through the tent wall corrected that guess almost instantly. She was already moving before she'd finished being afraid, twisting away from the opening and getting her forearm up between her own face and the animal's head as it pushed further into the collapsed tent, jaw working toward the jacket pocket rather than toward her. Castellano did the one thing behavioral guidance says to do in exactly this circumstance, and very likely did not know in the moment that she was doing it correctly. She fought back immediately, loud, with everything she had, instead of going still. A passive response is the right call against a grizzly that reads you as a threat to cubs. It is closer to the wrong call against a black bear that has decided your tent is a food source, because stillness reads as no resistance standing between the animal and the reward. She got a hand against the underside of the bear's jaw and shoved as she screamed, and the claw strike that opened her shoulder and the bite that closed on her forearm both landed in that same scramble before her headlamp, knocked on by reflex, threw hard light directly into the animal's face. 2 campers from the neighboring site arrived seconds later at a run, one of them holding a lit camp stove out in front of him like a torch. The combined noise and light broke the bear's confidence in under 8 seconds. It withdrew into the laurel below the site and did not return. Medical findings and aftermath. Castellano's injuries were a deep laceration from shoulder to mid-back requiring layered closure, and a forearm bite that fractured the ulna and required surgical plating. Infection risk from black bear bite wounds is elevated due to bacteria carried in the mouth from carrion feeding, and she was started on broad-spectrum antibiotics before the helicopter extraction even left the ridge. She recovered full use of the arm after 14 months of physical therapy. With a permanent loss of fine rotational strength, she still notices when she opens jars. She camped the following spring again, in the same park, on the advice of a wilderness therapist who told her that avoiding the woods entirely would cost her more than the bear already had. She now hangs 2 food bags instead of 1 and checks neighboring campsites before dark, a habit she describes simply as reading the whole site, not just my own. What stayed with Castellano longest wasn't the injury, but the disorientation of having done everything right and still ending up here. Her therapist's read on it. There was no single decision point that would have obviously changed the outcome, only a long chain of small, reasonable choices by several different people that happened to add up badly. Incident analysis. This was not a predatory attack, and Virginia wildlife investigators were unambiguous about that afterward. It was a food-conditioned sow responding to a scent source it had already learned to associate with tents specifically at 3 other sites that same week without consequence. A pattern of low-risk visits that eventually produces one visit where the animal pushes harder because nothing has ever stopped it before. What went wrong sat upstream of that night entirely. An unwashed pan at a neighboring site, a bear already habituated before either camper arrived, and a park corridor where bear density had been rising for 3 seasons faster than seasonal ranger patrols could manage food storage compliance across every site. What went right was entirely Castellano's own reaction and the speed of her neighbor's response. The 8 seconds between contact and withdrawal is short specifically because 3 people reacted immediately and correctly, without a single one of them freezing first. Practical takeaway. Your food storage only protects you as far as the worst prepared camper within smell range of your tent. Check what's cooking 2 sites over, because that bear doesn't know property lines. On a narrow river trail in the North Cascades, a fly fisherman would find out that the worst place to meet a mother grizzly is somewhere neither of you can turn around. Jonah Priest feels the brush behind him move before he hears anything, and by the time he turns, his rod is already falling out of his hand. 40 feet upstream, a cub bawls once, high and sharp. Priest's fishing partner, standing waist-deep in the river with a net still raised, freezes mid-motion, watching a shape come off the bank at a speed neither of them has a name for yet. What is already happening, before either man understands why, is a 310-pound sow grizzly closing the gap between herself and a man standing on the exact strip of trail her 3 cubs had just crossed. It was July 2013, on a narrow social trail paralleling the Chilliwack River in North Cascades National Park, Washington. Grizzly country in name and history more than in modern sightings, since the population here numbered in the single digits at the time, which is precisely why neither Priest nor his partner, Dave Renfro, had been thinking about bears at all. They'd hiked in for native cutthroat, following a trail so narrow in places that passing another hiker meant stepping into brush. Somewhere in that brush, unseen, 3 cubs had been crossing from a berry slope to the river when Priest rounded a bend 8 feet from the youngest one. Renfro had fished this stretch with Priest for 6 summers, and the 2 of them had a habit of talking loudly between casts precisely because black bears use the same river corridor most seasons, noise that normally bought them a wide margin of warning. That morning the current was running loud enough over a gravel bar upstream that their voices barely carried past each other, and neither man registered it as a problem worth mentioning. It should have been. Grizzlies, unlike the black bears they were used to sharing the river with, do not reliably move off at the sound of human voices, especially a sow already committed to moving her cubs across open ground. A sow with cubs between herself and a person she perceives as a threat has exactly one priority, and it is not the fish, the trail, or anything else in the immediate world. She closed 25 yards in under 3 seconds. Grizzlies are capable of short bursts near 35 miles per hour, faster than most people can process as real until it's already happened to them. Priest's mind, in that half second, ran through and discarded 3 wrong ideas: elk, dog, another fisherman, before the shape resolved into something with a hump and flattened ears bearing down the trail at him. Priest did not run, which almost certainly kept him alive. A charging bear's prey drive escalates sharply against anything moving away from it. He dropped to the ground, canister of bear spray already coming up from his hip belt, and got a 2-second burst of capsaicin fog into the air between himself and the closing animal at roughly 12 feet. Inside the 10 to 30-foot window where bear spray performs best, close enough that the sow ran through the edge of the cloud before she could fully arrest her charge. She hit him a glancing blow with one shoulder, more collision than attack, enough to open a 4-inch gash along his upper arm and knock him flat into the streambed gravel. Renfro, still in the river with a net in one hand, had frozen through the entire 3 seconds, unable to close the distance and unwilling to shout in case it redirected the charge toward the water instead of away from it. Then she stopped, Pepper spray creates a wall of irritation to eyes, nose, and airway that overrides almost every other input an animal is processing, and a sow whose priority was distance, not a kill. Used the opening to reverse rather than press an advantage she no longer had a clear read on. She gathered her cubs on the far bank within 20 seconds and did not look back. Priest lay in the gravel another full minute after she'd gone, coughing on the drifting edge of his own spray cloud, before Renfro finally reached him and got an arm under his shoulders. Medical findings and aftermath. Priest walked away with a single laceration requiring 22 stitches and bruised ribs from the impact. Treated at a Bellingham emergency room the same night after Renfro half-carried him 2 miles back to the trailhead over uneven ground in fading light, stopping twice to reapply pressure to the arm wound with a torn shirt. There was no bite trauma at all. The entire physical contact lasted under 2 seconds, consistent with what wildlife biologists classify as a contact charge rather than a sustained attack. The outcome bear spray is specifically designed to produce. Recovery was 6 weeks, limited mostly by the rib bruising rather than the laceration. Priest reported no lasting nerve or mobility issues, and unlike encounters involving a full mauling, there was no secondary infection risk from the wound, since it was a blunt impact injury rather than a puncture from teeth or claws penetrating deep tissue. Priest had grown up fishing this same river system with his father, long before the recovery program reintroduced grizzlies to the North Cascades in meaningful numbers, and some part of him had never fully updated his mental map of the risk here the way he had for black bears, which he'd encountered dozens of times without incident. Renfro would say afterward that the strangest part of the whole afternoon was how normal the first 20 minutes had felt. 2 friends working a familiar stretch of river, talking about nothing, before the day became something neither of them would describe the same way twice. Washington wildlife officials used the incident in later outreach material specifically because it illustrated a point most backcountry safety campaigns struggle to land. This was not a story about carelessness. Priest had bear spray, carried it correctly, and used it exactly as trained. The only variable outside anyone's control was a bend in a trail narrow enough that a family of grizzlies and a pair of fishermen ended up on the same 6 feet of ground at the same moment, in a landscape where that population, once reduced to almost nothing, was in the early stages of a slow and closely watched recovery. Incident analysis: what put Priest on that trail at that moment was nothing more than narrow terrain and bad timing. A bend in a fishing trail no wider than a hallway. At the exact minute 3 cubs were crossing it. There was no food smell, no camp, no decision he made wrong upstream of that bend. This is the category of encounter that even a careful, informed hiker cannot fully engineer around in true grizzly habitat. What did go right, and what Washington Fish and Wildlife's incident review flagged specifically, was the sequence Priest executed without hesitation. Stand your ground rather than run. Get spray deployed before contact rather than after, and accept a glancing hit rather than continuing to struggle once the animal disengaged. Bear spray carried on the hip, accessible in under 2 seconds, was the single factor investigators credited most directly with the difference between this outcome and a fatality. Practical takeaway: carry bear spray where you can reach it in 2 seconds without looking, not buried in a pack. In a sow with cubs encounter, that 2-second difference is the entire outcome. On the shoreline of Hudson Bay outside Churchill, Manitoba, a photographer was about to discover that a bear who shouldn't be there yet follows none of the timing anyone had planned around. Colin Baptiste lost the use of his right hand permanently, and it happened 11 feet from a running truck he never reached. His camera, a Nikon body worth more than his monthly rent, was found 40 yards away with the lens housing crushed flat. 3 bites. That's the count the trauma surgeon gave his family before Baptiste was even out of surgery. It was late October 2009, on the open coastal flats outside Churchill, Manitoba, weeks before the sea ice that polar bears depend on for seal hunting had begun to form. The flats here run gray and flat to the horizon in late fall, gravel and low willow scrub broken by snow fence lines. The town puts up every year to funnel bears away from the road into town. And the wind off the bay that week was carrying a raw, wet cold that had everyone in Churchill talking about how late the freeze was running. Baptiste, 29, a wildlife photographer from Winnipeg on his third season shooting the bear migration corridor, understood the seasonal pattern better than most tourists who pass through Churchill every fall. Polar bears gather near the coast in October and November, waiting for Hudson Bay to freeze, and in most years, by the time Baptiste arrived, the worst of the food stress had already passed, and the bears were calmer, more predictable, waiting rather than hunting. That year, freeze-up was running 2.5 weeks late. A bear that has gone 5 months without a substantial meal and is watching open water refuse to become ice is not the same animal the guidebooks describe. Local operators had been talking about the delay all week. Open water where there should have been shore-fast ice, bears drifting further inland along the tundra buggy routes looking for anything with calories, a scavenged seal carcass picked clean within hours instead of the usual day or two. Baptiste had heard all of it secondhand over dinner the night before and filed it as background information rather than something that changed what he'd be doing the next morning. He still planned his shoot around the same 40-yard rule he'd used all season, on the same stretch of coast he'd worked without incident for 2.5 weeks. Baptiste had parked his truck on a gravel spur, engine running per standard local protocol, and walked 40 yards out with a long lens to get low-angle shots of a bear he'd clocked at a safe distance 20 minutes earlier. He'd done this exact routine a dozen times that week without incident. Park close, engine on, walk a measured distance, shoot, retreat. Local guides had taught him the 40-yard figure as a working minimum for a calm, non-food-stressed bear. And every bear he'd photographed so far, that trip had behaved exactly as the figure predicted, disengaging or ignoring him entirely. What he hadn't clocked was a second bear, a male he estimated afterward at close to 900 pounds, that had been bedded in a shallow depression behind a snow fence line, and came up without warning at a distance Baptiste had judged safe for the wrong animal. A hungry polar bear in late freeze-up is one of the only bear scenarios in North America where investigators use the word predatory without qualification. This was not a defensive response to a startled animal, but a bear assessing a person as prey. The bear came up out of the depression in a single fluid motion, low to the ground, head level with its shoulders, moving in a straight line rather than the loping, half-curious approach Baptiste had seen from other bears that trip. He had time to register that the gait itself looked wrong before his own body was already turning for the truck. Baptiste ran for the truck. Running is close to the worst option against any bear, but against a polar bear already in a stalking posture, standing still offers no better outcome. The bear had already committed before Baptiste moved. It caught him 9 strides short of the door, closing the last few yards faster than his own legs could answer. Medical findings and aftermath. 2 tour guides working a nearby buggy route heard the commotion and closed the distance in their vehicle within about 90 seconds, laying on the horn and revving the engine, which was very likely what finally broke the bear's focus and let Baptiste crawl the last few feet to his own truck. Baptiste sustained bites to his right forearm and hand, a puncture wound to his lower back, and a fractured scapula from being knocked down twice during the encounter. The hand injury severed tendons that surgeons could not fully repair, leaving him with about 40% grip strength permanently. Polar bear bite wounds carry elevated infection risk similar to other large carnivores, and Baptiste spent 9 days on IV antibiotics in Winnipeg before doctors were confident the deep puncture wounds were clear. He returned to photography within a year, adapting his camera grip and shutter technique around the hand's remaining function, and has not returned to Churchill in shoulder season since, though he still shoots the area from vehicle-based tours in the safer weeks around full freeze-up. Baptiste had grown up in a family that spent every autumn around Hudson Bay in some capacity, his father a long-time tour operator in Churchill, and the 40-yard rule he'd been using was one his own father had taught him a decade earlier as a working guideline for exactly this kind of shoulder season shoot. It had never failed either of them before. In interviews afterward, Both men were careful to say the same thing wildlife officials eventually put in writing. The rule itself wasn't wrong. It was simply built for an average year, and 2009's delayed freeze had quietly moved every bear along that coast further past the edge of what the rule accounted for. Baptiste's recovery became something of a local case study in Churchill's tourism community, cited in guide training the following season as the clearest example anyone had of why buffer distances needed to flex with ice conditions rather than stay fixed to the calendar date, regardless of how reliable they had always been in years past. Incident analysis. The core failure here was applying a seasonal rulebook to a year that had stopped following it. Baptiste's 40-yard buffer from the first bear was a reasonable distance under normal late October conditions, when food stress hasn't yet peaked, and bears are more likely to disengage than commit to a chase. What he could not account for was a second bear he hadn't spotted, in a year where a delayed freeze had already pushed every bear in the corridor 2.5 weeks further into caloric deficit than his experience told him to expect. Manitoba Conservation's after-action review specifically flagged the truck's running engine and unlocked door as the single decision that kept this from becoming a fatality. Baptiste's 40-yard buffer gave him just enough head start to reach cover, even wounded, rather than being caught in open ground with no structure between himself and the animal. Practical takeaway. In shoulder season bear country, treat every year as if freeze-up or den timing is running late. The guidebook distance that worked last October is not a guarantee this October, and always keep an exit closer than the shot you're trying to get. Across the Atlantic, in the pine and birch forests of eastern Finland, a forestry worker would ignore a warning sign written in claw marks instead of words. Sami Koronen decided to finish marking the last row of timber alone, rather than wait for his crew to return from lunch. And that decision put him within 30 feet of a moose carcass a brown bear had spent 2 days caching under a pile of dragged branches and moss. It was late August, 2016, in a logging concession outside Kumo, in the North Karelia region of eastern Finland, close enough to the Russian border that the bear population here moves freely between both countries. Korhonen, 38, was a forestry contractor marking cut boundaries ahead of a harvest crew, work he'd done in this same stand for 6 seasons without incident. The crew of 4 had started at 7 that morning under a low gray sky, the kind of overcast that mutes sound and holds moisture in the moss underfoot. By midday, they'd covered most of the northern boundary and broken off for lunch at the trucks, leaving Korhonen to finish the last stretch alone while the light was still good and the weather was holding. That morning, before his crew broke for lunch, one of them had mentioned a strong smell near the eastern boundary line and a scatter of disturbed earth that looked like digging. Koronen made a note to check it later rather than now, and went back to his marking. The smell was a 5-day-old moose carcass. The digging was a bear's cache pile, built specifically to keep scavengers off a kill it intended to return to. A cache like this one is typically built within the first few hours after a kill. Branches, moss, and soil dragged over the carcass by an animal capable of moving several times its own body weight in debris. And a bear that has invested that effort returns to feed on the same site for days, sometimes more than a week, defending it the entire time. He went in alone, without telling anyone exactly where along the boundary he'd be. His radio, standard issue for every member of the crew, sat clipped to his belt on low volume, more habit than active tool, since checking in mid-task had never once mattered across 6 seasons of routine marking. A brown bear guarding a cache treats the area around it as a defended perimeter in a way that goes beyond a fresh kill. The caching behavior itself signals the bear's intent to return repeatedly, and animals defending a food investment they've already built infrastructure around respond faster and with less warning than animals defending a carcass found only minutes earlier. The bear, a male Korhonen's colleagues later estimated near 480 pounds from tracks and stride length, had been bedded within scent range of the cache the entire time, close enough to hear every strip of tape being torn and tied along the line Korhonen was walking. The stand itself worked against him in ways he wouldn't have been able to see from the boundary line. Thick moss underfoot swallowed footsteps, and a stand of young spruce screened the cache pile from more than 15 feet in any direction. Koronen's own marking tape, tied to trunks every 20 yards to guide the harvest crew, led him on a line that passed within 30 feet of the cache almost by coincidence. The boundary he was marking had nothing to do with the kill site, and neither he nor the bear had any way of predicting the two lines would cross that close together. He was reaching up to tie a strip of tape to a birch trunk when the bear came off its bed at a dead run, covering the 30 feet before Koronen had fully turned toward the sound. There was no vocalization first, no bluff. A bear guarding an established cache treats any approach within its defended radius as a challenge already in progress rather than one still being decided. Koronen got one arm up. It was not enough distance, and it was not enough warning for anything else to have been. Medical findings and aftermath. Koronen's crew found him 90 minutes later when he failed to answer a radio check, following his marking tape back along the boundary line until it led them within sight of the cache. The Finnish police forensic report concluded the cause of death was a bite to the neck, consistent with a single close-range attack, with additional trauma to the torso from claw strikes sustained during a brief struggle. There is no indication he had time to retreat more than a few steps, and no indication he ever reached for the radio at his belt. At 38, in strong physical condition from manual forestry work, Korhonen's body showed the kind of injury pattern investigators associate with an animal that considered the threat to its cache resolved within seconds, rather than a prolonged, sustained mauling, brief and catastrophic rather than extended. Finnish wildlife authorities tracked and destroyed the bear 9 days later after confirming its identity through the cache site and a set of matching claw measurements. Standard practice once a bear has caused a human fatality in a defended cache context rather than a startled, defensive one. Incident analysis. The chain here started with information that arrived and was set aside rather than acted on. A crew member's report of a strong smell and disturbed earth was, in isolation, exactly the kind of vague field observation loggers hear regularly without it meaning anything. The problem was going back into that same boundary line alone, without radioing a location, before anyone had checked what the smell actually was. Metsahalidis's post-incident safety review noted that cache sites are typically defended with far less warning than a bear encountered by surprise in open terrain, because the animal has already committed resources to the location and reads any approach as a direct threat to that investment rather than a chance encounter to size up first. Korhonen's crew did what they could once the alarm was raised. They held their position, radioed authorities immediately rather than approaching the site themselves, and waited for an armed ranger team, which kept a bad outcome from becoming two. Metsahalidis made cache awareness training mandatory for every forestry contractor operating in bear range within the year, built directly around what happened outside Kumo. Any report of strong carrion smell or disturbed earth now triggers an immediate, group-based check before work continues nearby. No exceptions for how routine the task feels. His widow later told a regional newspaper that 6 seasons without incident weren't recklessness. It was experience. And experience is exactly what makes a vague report easy to file away as unimportant. The forest doesn't send a clearer signal the 10th time than it did the first. Practical takeaway. A vague report of smell or disturbed ground near a work site is not vague. Treat it as a probable cache and clear it as a group in daylight before anyone goes back to work alone nearby. 6,000 miles east, in the Sikot-Alin range of Russia's Far East, a hunter would misjudge exactly how much room he had left to react. The taiga here doesn't open up the way forests do further north. Korean pine and Mongolian oak grow so close together that visibility drops to 15-20 feet in places, and the only sound for most of a morning is your own boots on wet leaf litter. Fog had settled into the lower ground overnight and hadn't fully burned off by mid-morning, thick enough in the hollows that a shape 20 feet away resolved as little more than a darker patch of gray until it moved. No birds called from the understory either. Small birds working the leaf litter go silent and scatter when a bear moves through, well before a human ear picks up any other sign. and the silence itself should have told Artyom Kozlov something. Kozlov, 44, was a subsistence hunter and part-time ranger near the Sikhote-Alin Nature Reserve, Primorsky Krai, in Russia's Far East, working a boar trail he'd hunted for over a decade. It was October 2018. He'd left his cabin before first light, coffee still in his thermos, planning to be back before noon with enough meat to carry his household through the first hard weeks of winter. A routine trip along ground he could have walked with his eyes closed in any other year. He came here for meat before winter, carrying an Izhmash-built bolt-action rifle chambered in 7.62 by 54R, loaded with 182-grain soft-point rounds, standard for the region, more than sufficient against boar and, at the right range, against a bear. The problem that morning wasn't the rifle, it was the range. Kozlov had been following fresh boar sign downwind, moving slowly, rifle carried across his body rather than shouldered, the way he always moved on a slow stalk. The sign was less than an hour old, sharp-edged tracks in soft ground, a scraped patch of earth where boar had been rooting for fallen acorns. He was reading that sign, eyes down, when the trail curved through a dense stand of oak and put him almost on top of a Ussuri brown bear. A male reserve ranger's later estimated at nearly 550 pounds from the carcass and stride length, working the same acorn fall from the opposite direction. Neither animal nor man had scented the other. The fog and the dead still air had erased the one early warning signal both of them would normally have had. The distance between them when they saw each other was later paced out by reserve rangers at under 12 feet, inside almost every safe engagement threshold hunters are trained to expect, and far too close for a raised, aimed rifle shot to happen before the bear closed the gap entirely. The bear came up onto its hind legs for less than a second, then dropped forward into the charge, closing the 12 feet in under a second and a half. Kozlov got the rifle barrel up rather than fully shouldered, and fired one round into the animal's chest at near contact range as it reached him. A hit investigators later confirmed was fatal to the bear within roughly a minute, though it did nothing to stop the bear from making contact first. A soft point round at that range delivers massive tissue damage, but not instant incapacitation. No shot placement against a bear's chest cavity shuts down a nervous system already mid-charge. The bear's momentum carried it into him, claws opening his back and shoulder as it passed, jaws closing once on his thigh before it staggered off a few yards and went down for good. Kozlov's survival came down to that wound killing the bear before it could turn back for a second, more targeted attack. Medical findings and aftermath. The damage came down to a fractured collarbone, deep claw lacerations across his back and shoulder, and a bite to his thigh that missed the femoral artery by less than an inch. He walked out roughly 2 miles to a forestry road under his own power, in shock, before being intercepted by a passing logging truck. Surgeons in Vladivostok closed the lacerations and repaired the fracture with plating. The thigh wound required debridement over several days due to infection risk from the bite, common with brown bear wounds given bacteria carried from carrion feeding. He regained full use of the leg after 5 months and returned to hunting the following autumn, though he now carries a sidearm as a close-range backup in addition to the rifle. Kozlov's recovery became something of a talking point in the small community around the reserve, partly because subsistence hunters and rangers there rarely survive an encounter this close without a firearm doing exactly what his did. Reserve staff, who had worked alongside him for years, used the case in their own seasonal briefings to hunters entering mast year zones. Carry a rifle in a low-ready position rather than slung. Know your minimum reaction distance for your specific weapon, and never assume dense fog or heavy cover only hides the animal from you rather than hiding you from it in equal measure. Kozlov himself became something of a reluctant local authority on the subject, willing to describe the encounter in detail to visiting researchers studying human-bear conflict patterns in the Far East, though he always finished the same way. He had done nothing differently than he had 100 times before, and the only reason he was alive to tell it was that his shot landed a few inches to the left of where he'd aimed, catching more of the bear's chest than he'd planned for at a range where planning had already stopped mattering. Incident analysis Sikhoty-Alyn's brown bear density is among the highest in the Russian Far East, specifically because of dense acorn mast years like 2018, when oak stands draw in every bear within miles to feed before denning. Reserve biologists were clear afterward that Kozlov had done nothing unusual for a hunter working this ground in late fall. Following fresh sign downwind is standard practice, and the terrain itself, not any decision he made, was what collapsed his margin from a manageable 50 or 60 yards down to 12 feet in the space of a few footsteps. What kept this from becoming a fatality was Kozlov's response once the bear was already committed. Getting the barrel up and firing before impact rather than after, even without a clean shoulder mount, turned an encounter that could easily have gone the other way into one he walked away from on his own legs. Practical takeaway. In dense mast-year forest, assume any fresh sign means a bear could already be inside your minimum safe distance. Carry a fast, close-range backup, because a rifle you can't swing and fire in under a second is not the tool that saves you at 12 feet. The pattern across all 6 of these cases holds whether the ground is Montana timber, a Virginia ridge, or a Russian oak stand thousands of miles east. Distance is the only variable that consistently determines who walks out and who doesn't. And the moment that distance collapses is almost never the moment anyone saw coming. 6 encounters, 3 continents, 2 decades apart, and the same finding every time. It was never the size of the animal or the caliber in someone's hands that decided the outcome. It was distance, and how fast that distance disappeared before anyone had time to choose. If you want more breakdowns like this, real terrain, real animal behavior, real decisions under pressure, subscribe and tell us in the comments which case stuck with you. Stay safe out there.
Hey, we need your help. If you've loved these terrifying true stories so far, we need your help to keep sharing them and create new episodes every week. Please grab your phone, scan the QR code now, and tap the subscribe button that opens on your screen.